Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. I'm Warwick Powell. I'm a senior fellow at Taihe Institute, and I'm your host for today's program. TIO Talks seeks to explore contemporary issues within a broader setting, and particularly with a view to bringing Asian perspectives or perspectives on Asia to the global conversation. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about how China and the Chinese economy and government are likely to be able to respond to the unfolding tariff wars. And I'm pleased to have as our guest today Professor Yan Liang. Yan Liang is a professor of economics at Willamette University in North America. Welcome to the show, and thanks for sharing your time and wisdom with us, Yan.
Yeah, thank you, Warwick, for inviting me.
Great. Today's conversation is going to start at the big picture and then work our way, hopefully, depending on our time, to the implementation nitty-gritty. At a big picture level, set against the context of the trade wars, which in effect is cutting off access to the North American market for Chinese exporters, the response is a combination of fiscal stimulus as well as opening up other markets. Could you perhaps give us a little bit of detail on the discussions that have been taking place in China today, which is the 2nd of May, incidentally, and how the Chinese policy apparatus is thinking about its response regime or its set of responses to the current situation?
Right. So I think the major policies have been announced at the NPC, National People's Congress, back in March. And so at that time, I think there has already been this, the awareness that the U.S. is going to, initiate this trade war. As a matter of fact, the first tranche, if you remember, the tariff against China was actually imposed on February the 2nd in the name of fentanyl issues, right? So I think March NPC was taking place in that context. So they have already announced, expansionary or proactive fiscal policy and also moderately expansionary monetary policy. So this is quite, from the face value of the way they describe the policy, it seems that they are going to count on monetary policy and fiscal policy to help to cushion this external shock. So when it comes to fiscal policy, they talked about raising the deficit to GDP ratio from normally 3% to 4%, which is quite significant. They're going to increase, the deficit spending by, I believe, 1.6 trillion more than last year, than 2024. They announced the issuance of ultra long treasury bonds of 1.3 trillion yuan, which is again up by 300 billion from the year before. And then another 500 billion special bonds to recapitalize the banks. And local governments are also allowed to issue more, the so-called special purpose bonds, to the tune of 4.4 trillion yuan, which is again more than what it was authorized last year, which is 3.9 trillion. So all of this basically mean that they're going to issue new debt in the amount of 11.86 trillion yuan. And so that in total, it's about close to 3 trillion more than 2024. So that's quite, I would say quite expansionary in terms of fiscal stimulus. And so this last Friday, when the Politburo met, they didn't announce any new issuance of bonds or new fiscal spending, but just to say that they're going to accelerate the issuance of bonds and also increase the fiscal spending, which I think they did. When you look at the first quarter, China has registered really solid growth of 5.4% real GDP expansion, right? And I think largely that not only thanks to the front loading of exports that did help quite a bit, but also more importantly, I think the fiscal spending has gone up by 4.2% year on year in the first quarter. And fiscal revenue has gone down by 1.1% because of the tax rebates, because of tax cuts, and so on and so forth. So that in total, we're looking at a 5.3% right increase in the deficit spending in the first quarter. And so I think that just showcase that this fiscal policy has been in place. And so that's what the Politburo meeting was emphasizing, which is that we have the policy already in place. Now it's the time to implement and really sort of front load some of these policies. Now, monetary policy so far has been quite, I would say, put. The both first year lending rates, 5-year lending rate have remained the same. There's no new RRR cuts. I think for a variety of reasons, I think the belief is that the current liquidity is still ample, and if there's any injection of liquidity, it would be more targeted for sectors, like, for example, export-oriented sectors. They might get more support. And we hear actually from the Politburo meeting that there will be more relending facilities to subsidize and to lend more to certain companies, and also for services sector, especially elder care, child care, and other service consumption. So I think for monetary policy, they wanted to try to strike the balance between monetary easing, but also at the same time stabilize the value of the currency, and also try to make sure that banks are healthy, right, to earn sufficient amount of profit margins. So then you don't want it to lower the interest rate too much. So I think that's where China is right now. It's at, and so they remain very vigilant. They are going to roll out policies in a much more efficient way. But that said, I know you are going to have the follow-up questions about sort of the central local coordination, and I think that is still remain an issue, and that needs to be worked out, I think, in a more forceful manner.
Before we get to there, perhaps just for the benefit of our viewers, if I could ask you just to explain this issue of debt. Debt is an emotionally laden word, but when we're talking about deficits and debts from the point of view of government funding into the economy, we're really talking about the injection of new money into the system as a whole. Could you just describe that a little bit for us, so that the people watching today actually understand what's going on from a system point of view, as opposed to viewing this as a question of debt and that emotional response that word often invokes?
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent question. So we do know that credit, right, is what drives the resources mobilization. So if you wanted to start a new economic activity, you need a credit to finance it, right? So how do we create credit? Well, credit is created at both the government level. So the government is able to, a sovereign government that issues its own currency and tax and collects tax payments in its own currency, is what we call the government with the full monetary sovereignty. So the credit can be created at the government level. When government spends, they credit your bank account. And so that is new money that is being created, as you said, right, in the private sector. So if I'm the government, I go out to spend, I buy a computer from you, Warwick Inc., you receive a payment from the government. So now, private money is increased. So the government's debt, in this case, right, the government spending creates the surplus for the private sector. So that's how credit is created at the public sector level. Credit is also created at the private sector level, and that's because these commercial banks, these various credit institutions, they have special license, right, from the government. The government allows them to issue their own credit, and this bank credit is traded on par, one-on-one, with the government credit. So in other words, when you go out spend your money, right, if you give $1 or $1 Australian in the paper form, the business will take it as $1. Right? If you swap a bank card with your bank deposit of $1, the seller would take it exactly as $1. It's always 1-to-1 ratio because the government says that's the case. So at the private sector level, credit is created when banks lend. So when banks lend, that means the private sector is getting this credit, they deposit it, or they purchase products. Eventually, this credit gets deposited back to the banking system. So, as you probably know, I come from sort of this school of thought called the modern monetary theory, right? So the simple way to put it is credit is created in two ways. Government spends the money into existence, banks lend money into existence. So if you understand that mechanism, right, then this government debt is nothing but just government is creating credit for the economy. And as long as the government is able to maintain its monetary sovereignty, in other words, the government money is accepted generally in the economy, then the government will never run out money, right? And so it can always pay its bill. It can always honor its debt. And when this debt is well used, especially like I said, it increases this private sector surplus, and especially if this money is spent in a way that increases the productive capacity of the economy, then I think we don't need to worry about the affordability in the first place. But as far as the resources are concerned, I think if the money is well spent, the credit is well spent, that helps to augment, right, the resources availability for society. So I think that is important to understand. So when you say government spends and increase debt, that is nothing to be sort of worried about as far as the payability is concerned. But we do want to spend money in a productive way, right? If the government spending simply enrich the billionaires, right, the wealthy class, and it simply use resources in a wasteful way, then that's not something that we want.
So basically, what's happening is that with the tariffs that have been imposed, in effect, it's bringing a halt to trade both ways. And we're looking at a government response, principally, together with some monetary policy response, to augment or plug the gap that's been left through what has been a net surplus as a result of trade with the United States. That's basically what we're talking about, isn't it?
Right, absolutely. I think this is sort of when you think about the aggregate demand, right? That includes consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So again, the U.S.'s net exports China's net exports to the United States, it's about 1.57% of GDP as of 2024. So if let's say this tariff war would completely eliminate that sort of the trade between the two countries, and so that 1.57% GDP will go away, then the easiest way or the most effective way to counteract is to increase government spending, right? To increase that by 1.7% of GDP. But I don't think it really takes that much, because we still have multiplier effects. When you increase government spending, it could crowd out investments, it could increase private consumption. So in a way, I think what is really needed as far as the fiscal spending is concerned, it's much less than what you show in this sort of just the face value. And there are people who ask, why can we use other measures to increase consumption? Well, the point though is consumption is a result of economic growth, right? Consumption primarily depends on income. So if you wanted to increase income, if you want to maintain GDP growth, then you want investment or government spending to increase, because they are autonomous. They don't depend on the income. They're not the results of income growth. They're the cause of income growth. So you can't rely on consumption growth when consumption growth itself depends on GDP growth, right? So that's why we need to focus on either private investment or government spending. Now, private investment, of course, if it increases, that would be great, but it is a lot of ask, right? This is a difficult time for private enterprises to be willing to invest more with all the uncertainty, also with demand shock. So that's why I think the government spending is the most practical and feasible way to help to cushion against this external shock on the demand side.
Yeah, that being said, the private sector in China, I think, has been in certain sectors anyway, not necessarily in every sector,
Mhm.
has been increasing its demand for credit from the banking system, and that's contributing obviously to aggregate demand. The other thing that we haven't touched on is, of course, the ongoing growth in trade that China itself is experiencing, or Chinese enterprises is experiencing with other countries in the world. So part of the offset is the growth in trade with the rest of the world as well. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I wanted to, just responding to that 2 points, right? So again, last year, the fixed asset investment in China grew by 3.1%. This first quarter, 4.2%. So it's clearly the investment is going, right? That the private investors as well as public sector investment are increasing, and so therefore we do see this solid growth. So what I'm saying here is, again, ceteris paribus, right? That if the investors are willing to increase investment by 4.2% in the first quarter, the second quarter they probably will continue to invest, no doubt about it. But maybe the growth will be slower just because of this uncertainty and external shock. So that's why I meant it's not like we're not going to get any private investment growth, right? We will get private investment growth, but if we need that extra, right, then I think that could come from the public sector investment. As a matter of fact, the first quarter infrastructure investment has gone up by 5.9% or 5.8%. In that neighborhood. So that is, again, tremendous stimulus. And I would also argue that contrary to many of the arguments that China needs to slow down investment, in fact, I think China needs to increase investment, but in the quality way, right? So new urban infrastructure, renewable energy sector, cutting edge, again, sort of the infrastructure in some of the service sector, like data center and so on, in tech sector. I think those are really important, and it will continue not only to help to drive the short-term, investment growth to cushion the external shock, but also long-term that really help to boost productivity growth, right? Investment is the driving force of the economy. Consumption can validate the investment, but consumption itself cannot drive economic growth. So no doubt, investment is important, and no doubt, China is going to continue to see very solid investment growth. And the trade front, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we have this conversations, ongoing conversation, right? The U.S. is not the market, right? The U.S.'s importance has declined over time, from about 20% of China's total exports back in Trump first term to now 14.6%. So 15% of China's exports go to the United States. With some of the indirect exposure through Vietnam, Mexico, so on and so forth, maybe it adds to another 5%. But still, China has many trading partners, right? As a matter of fact, ASEAN countries are the largest trade partner with China. Europeans are the second largest. The U.S. is the third. And so, the exports, as we know, to the BRI country has exceeded, the U.S.'s share back in 2023, and it continued to be the case. So China exports more to the global south than EU, Japan, and the US combined. So there are these markets to be explored. But that said, I know that there has been a concern that, somehow if China needs to reroute its exports from the United States to the global south, that's going to flood the market, and that create a lot of sort of fear and concern. But I do want to say, China does not really depend that much on exports, and increasingly so, right? We know that if you look at the net export to GDP ratio, it peaked in 2027. And right now, the last number I got, it's about 4.6%. That is, how little the net export to GDP is. And I think for some of the developing South countries, China may be a competitor in some sectors, but a lot of times China, I think, really helps these countries by exporting very essential capital goods, intermediate goods, machinery, and industrial components. And that is very essential. I mean, take Vietnam as example. China accounts for 30% of Vietnam's imports. And a lot of these are really important for Vietnam's industrialization, for its industrial production, without which, Vietnam is not going to be able to export to the United States or even to other countries. So I think that's the context. That's important to understand that, yes, China is able to find other export markets, but China doesn't overly rely on these export markets. And it's a mutually beneficial trading relationship if you look into it. And so this proposition, right, that the U.S. can somehow unite other countries and alien China, I think that is very unrealistic.
One of the interesting things that I think you kind of hinted at, but perhaps I could ask you to flesh out a little bit, is the nexus between fiscal policy stimulus together with this idea of what is in effect development finance. So if the export sector is exporting things like capital goods and intermediate goods to developing countries, then in fact China's own stimulus through the operations of the government is contributing not only to the development of domestic industry, but it's also contributing to the development of capacity in the global south, which then spurs on another round of economic growth in those markets, particularly for end consumer goods.
Yeah, well, I think you touched on a very interesting question, and I think it's very multidimensional when you think about development finance, right? So this direct exports to the global South country is not exactly part of the development finance, but when you put it that way, right, these important industrial output, industrial exports from China, it does help to enhance productive capacity of the global South countries. But we also know that China, invests, to the north of $1 trillion since the BRI in the past 20-ish years. And so, well, actually starting from 2000, that's when China really started to sort of going out. But the major, development finance really started to scale up since the BRI in 2013. So I think from that angle, it's also very interesting to see that China is pretty much recycling its export revenues, right? Its dollar revenues from its exports, and use that to finance the development in the developing countries, primarily in infrastructure, and in recent years a lot of in utility, in transportation and industrial parks and so on and so forth. So from seen from that view, I think you're right. I think China is contributing, and its own domestic policy that help to expand its own economy would benefit the rest of the world through multiple channels, through healthy, its own growth. It increases imports, right? It's imports from many different developing countries, right? Agricultural products and minerals, and some more sort of industrial products at a relatively lower skill levels that really fit these developing countries' competitive advantage. So I think that import demand is important. China does import, to the tune of 2 trillion yuan, $2 trillion every year. So it's not something trivial. In fact, many countries rely on China's imports. Australia, Brazil, and others, Chile, right? So I think that is one channel of China's contribution to the rest of the world, is through the import channel, and then through the export channel, as you just mentioned, and then through the development finance, and then from technological sharing, and so on and so forth. So I think China's engagement with the rest of the world, it is very meaningful. It's very helpful, I think, for developing countries, this growth.
Look, so far we've largely touched on, I guess, what you'd call the macro accounting of the impact or the responses to offset the loss of one set of revenues through various forms of actions. But in doing so, you touched on some qualitative dimensions, and I'd like to drill into those a little bit now, if I can. And they really go to two dimensions, I think. One is the dimension of the industry sectors that you've identified as being important as part of the next phase of public and private investment development in China, and how in doing that it also impacts on the nature of household consumption, particularly through the geographical distribution of economic growth in China. We've seen recent data, for example, that suggests very strongly that household consumption growth has been far greater in second, third, and fourth tier cities than in the first tier cities. So, really, it's a double barreled question. One is around the qualitative dimensions of the next phase of investment. And the second part, or the second barrel, is how does that begin to translate into household consumption growth?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think, as most of the China scholars understand, we don't have one China, we have many little Chinas within China, because regional disparity is humongous. And I think that is a challenge, but at the same time, it does present opportunities. So as you just mentioned, the most recent data, I think, many people, or the Western observers, right, they talk a lot about this declining or diminishing marginal return on consumption stimulus, right? Because they look at the data and say, wow, Shanghai and Beijing, they're not selling, their white goods, their sales have been stalling despite all these consumption subsidies. But what they forget to look at is outside these so-called tier one cities, you still have the so-called, what do they call it? Semi first tier, or next first tier.
The
And
new
that
first tier?
includes first tier, yes, right, right. So cities like Hangzhou, Changsha, Tianjin, some of these, new first tier cities, they have registered really healthy consumption growth. And then you have the second tier cities, right? And that again includes dozens of Kunming, Hangzhou, Quanzhou, and so on and so forth. And they have also seen quite, healthy consumption growth. So I think the indication here is that yes, in some of the very rich cities, maybe the consumption has come to some kind of saturation, even though only, I would argue, with the goods, right? Certain goods, maybe household appliances, electronics, and so on and so forth. Because, these rich consumers, they already have more than one, more than two. They don't necessarily need to continue to buy more. And they are not as maybe incentivized to buy with the price effect, with the subsidies and so on and so forth. But I think the second tier cities, the third tier cities, and many others, they see very solid income growth, and they see very solid consumption growth. So I think that is really the sort of the opportunities for China. As a matter of fact, many of the reports in the past, like McKinsey and Global, they have identified that first tier cities will be very difficult because competition is so high, because market has been relatively saturated. Companies should go to the second city, the third city, and so on and so forth. And so I think that is an indication that China still has a vast market that is relatively untapped, that still has a lot of growth potential. And so we're also seeing, these investment projects that are being introduced and encouraged in some of the second, third, and more hinterland cities, for example, data center projects, to utilize really the cheap energies, the vast amounts of land and so on and so forth. So I do see that as an opportunity, right? As the policy support to continue to increase, and also just as naturally, right? When these cities markets gets too competitive, when the growth and somehow start to decline, still positive, right? But declining, and labor costs start rising, I see more and more companies will shift to these other, second tier, third tier cities. As a matter of fact, when you look at some of the companies, they also say the same thing. They say, instead of moving the factories to Vietnam or Cambodia, they are more now considering to remove to reshore, to go back to China, but to the more, the next tier cities. And so I think that's a trend that I think one should not neglect.
The processes by which this happens, of course, in China is mediated in large part through the active involvement of local governments. This is quite a unique institutional feature of Chinese governance and economic policy implementation. And perhaps as we progress this discussion, we've literally gone from the highest of macro aggregate levels and moved our way now down to the city level, at least. I don't think we'll get to the township or the village level today. Um, what are some of the issues that have been faced by government ambitions to translate the liquidity that is being injected into the system to reach their destination point, if you will, and to achieve the biggest bang for buck from an industry development point of view and also from an aggregate wage growth point of view?
Yeah. So I think in this case, I think we're talking about more of the fiscal system, how, when the central government uh, provides the extra fiscal capacity, right? How does that trickle, or how does that filter through all these different levels of systems, different levels of governments? And you're absolutely right. It's a complicated system, right? From the central, then to the provincial, to the prefectural, to the city, and to the towns, the counties, the towns, and to the villages. So there's all the system that needs to be filtered through. And so sometimes the system doesn't work as efficiently. Money gets stuck in somewhere, or it gets funneled to a different purpose. And so that happens. But I think the more important difficulty right now is still the imbalance between the central and the local government in terms of fiscal revenues and their fiscal responsibilities, their fiscal spending. So we know that the fiscal revenues is quite evenly distributed between the center and the local. The local government gets about 54% of the total fiscal revenue. The central gets about 46%. And so this data is as late as 2023. But the problem is that the local governments are responsible for 86% of the fiscal spending. So you're getting only half of the revenues, and yet you are accounting for 86% of the spending. And so that naturally puts the local government in this constant deficit situation, that they're constantly needing more financial support from the central government. This is just by design. It has nothing to do with the incompetency of the local government in manage their budgets, or with corruption or with misinvestment and so on and so forth. It's just by nature, the way the fiscal system works is it basically puts the local government in such a situation that they need constant fiscal transfer from the central government. And that has been the case, that the centrality, the central government has been transferred both in the general sort of funds, general transfer, but also some of the specific, earmarked kind of transfer for specific programs at the local government level. And then the local government, going from provincial, then they, again, funnel that money down to the city level and so on and so forth. So there's this tiers of filtering through the fiscal, spending. So go back to this question, I think now the dilemma is that the local government is inundated in debt. And a lot of these are on their balance sheets. It's a direct fiscal spending that exceeds their revenues, and the local government is authorized by the central government to issue certain bonds, right? So that's what I talked about earlier. For example, last year, 3.9 trillion quota for the local government to take on debt, and this year 4.4 trillion. So there's some help that are given to the local government in both fiscal transfer, but also in terms of the bond sales. But still, if you think about it, right, all these bond sales are simply, in a way, it is still debt. It's still debt at the local government level. It's a better type of debt than the shadow about borrowing by the local governments. If you remember, before 2014, local governments are not allowed to issue bonds to finance the deficit spending. So what they did was to set the so-called local government funding vehicles, LGFV. Through these funding vehicles, they borrow from commercial banks, from other financial institutions to support their spending. And a lot of times they use the land as collateral, as capital, and so on and so forth. So that created a lot of this hidden debt, right? And so that's what, really alert the central government. And so instead of letting, the scheme to run, which, as you can see, it's both costly, because all these shadow borrowing is much more costly than if you issue, municipal bonds. And second is also it poses great, danger and risk, because it's so opaque, right, to the entire financial system. And it also helped to breed more, corruption and deal making and so on and so forth. So that's when the central government say, look, you should have better management on your debt. So instead of having all this LGFV to issue debt, the local government, now you're giving the quota, you can go ahead, right, and to formalize your debt, you can issue more debt to support your spending. Now, that in some ways I think is improvement, but still the local government is in debt, right? That is the reality. So 47% to GDP is the local government on the book sort of debt, right? That is recognized by the public, by the official account. But there's all this hidden debt, which again it's almost a guesstimate, right? The treasuries, the Ministry of Finance in China recognize part of these local government funding vehicle debt. I think they put it to, I want to say 27% of GDP, but I could be wrong on that specific number. But it's only, I would say, a small proportion of the total LGFV debt, right? Partly is because I think the central government doesn't believe this is semi-public debt. They just don't think these LGFV has anything to do with the fiscal spending. They're doing their commercial, they're doing their business borrowing. So the central government does not want to recognize that kinds of the debt, right? Now, the IMF, of course, say all these LGFV debt is the government, pretty much local government debt. And so they put the number, to $9 trillion, right? More than half of the Chinese GDP back in 2023 is, I think, when they did the calculation. But long story short is that the local government is quite heavily in debt, right? Whereas the central government, right now, their debt to GDP ratio is about 25%, right? You compare to any countries in the world, it's very, very low. So in that case, even if you follow traditional kind of so-called fiscal room, fiscal space, the the 60% debt to GDP ratio that is often used, the Chinese central government still has enormous fiscal space, right, to be able to deficit spend, to increase debt. And I think that is very important. That's what they should do, to increase the central government debt and help to funnel the funds to the local government to help to relieve the debt burden and to allow them to continue to fiscal spend, to support infrastructure, to support social programs, to support their operations, and to pay back the debt that they owe to the local suppliers. And so I think that it's important, to really get the fiscal spending going and really get that fiscal stimulus, to roll it out in an effective way.
Look, it sounds like a very big job to do a massive rebalance sheet restructure across the whole country, but the vertical fiscal imbalance that you talk about seems to be a feature actually across the world, or at least in many parts of the world, where the institutions that are required to do the heavy lifting with the doing actually have limited revenue raising rights, whereas those institutions that have incredible revenue raising rights, including the creation or the issuance of new monies, actually don't have many spending responsibilities. Um, what prospect, incidentally, do you think there is for this kind of balance sheet tidy up to, in effect, take the debts that sit on local government balance sheets and restructure them to be debts that sit on central government balance sheets? Over time, do you think that that's a likely trajectory? And what are the implications of that, for instance, in terms of concerns that people might have on moral hazards, and whether or not that will ultimately result in the central government uh, constraining its own fiscal capacity if you follow that sort of traditional logic?
Well, that's a great question. I think the difficulty here is it's not necessarily institutional one, right? It's not a technical difficulty to reform, but I think yes, it does have a lot to do with the political aspect of it, because there's always the concern that if you're giving too much fiscal power at the local level, right, then the central government will be weakened. And so, and that moral hazard story is also being, told oftentimes that it's what, made the central government hesitant to have these kinds of reforms. But I do think that it is necessary. I think either from a infrastructure spending, developments, sort of finance going forward. Um, China has benefited a lot from these local governments' efforts, right, to build infrastructure, to encourage local businesses, to support local, manufacturers, and so on and so forth. So I do think it's very important to give that kind of fiscal power to the local government, one way or the other, right? If you do want to continue with the transfer, I think sure, you could do that. I mean, as a matter of fact, this kinds of scheme, has been going on since the 90s, right? That's when a lot of this reform was being voiced, at that time, by the former Ministry of Finance, talking about, we need fiscal reform. Never really happened, but this fiscal transfer has been helpful, right, in a great sense. And also, we know that things were not as bleak before because the local governments were able to utilize land sales to augment their fiscal revenues. The local governments prior to 2020's policy pivot, they rely on land sales for about 1/3 of their total revenues. But the land sales, as we all know, has plummeted, right, by more than 1/3 since 2020. So that created even more of a fiscal situation, right, that is harder to cope with through the previous fiscal transfer, these patchwork kind of fix. But I think going forward, I think it is very important, not only because of, again, the fiscal responsibility at the local government way exceed their fiscal capacity, but also just because of the way that, a lot of these sort of the discussions about increased welfare spending and so on and so forth. I think it also makes it very difficult when you have a pension system where it's very much localized, when you have healthcare insurance, when you have unemployment insurance. A lot of these are localized, where at the same time you have all these migrant workers that go from one location to the other. It creates a lot of this coordination problem. And so I think that needs to be fixed with fiscal reform. It's one of the, I think, key component to it. So I see the necessities, and I can also see, it becomes even more urgent as of now. But I also see the political barrier to do that, and I can see also the sort of inertia always fall back to this fiscal transfer and some other patchwork kind of fix. So it's very difficult to sort of see, right, without a crystal ball, when that kind of fiscal reform will take place. But I think moderation, some improvements, some small fixes will continue, and we have been seeing this with more encouragements for local government special bond issuance, and also more kind of just at the incentives part to allow the local governments to take more actions, because the local governments are also very worried about doing the wrong thing, right? And I think the central government tends to put a lot more on the penalty side in the past few years. And so now I think they're trying to instill more support and confidence to local government cadres and allow them to take more I would say bolder actions to help their local economies. And so I think that might be helpful in some ways. When you again read the documents, read between the lines, you can see the central government's directives now is a lot more positive to encourage local governments to take actions.
Wow, we've covered an incredible amount of ground actually in the last 35, 40 minutes. We've literally gone from having a bird's eye view over system liquidity, really in response to constraints on net exports, all the way through to how do you align incentives together with delivery, together with revenue responsibility at a local level. We could go on for a lot more time, and perhaps in the future we'll dig into some of these aspects in detail. But Yen, perhaps if I could just ask you to take all of what we've discussed so far and take that big step back again to the big picture level. How would you summarize the state of the Chinese political economy response to the current global and domestic situation? And how would you rate its prospects of being able to successfully not just navigate through the current storms, but perhaps leverage the disruption to arrive at a better, more sustainable place afterwards?
Right. So first of all, I think if we look at the sort of the supply side, right, and we look at the long term sort of economic fundamentals, um, I think China has a lot of potential, and China has a lot of endogenous forces that would help it to grow. What I meant by that is we see that technological leapfrogging. We see that China has been investing so much in the past and at the present into its physical infrastructure, into its human talents, into a lot of innovative I would say spirits in the economy, right? Through somewhat healthy and somewhat unhealthy competition. Um, I think just the long-term trajectory, right? You're seeing China is, leading in many of the technologies, the critical technologies. I remember that Bloomberg has run the analysis out of the 13 critical, technologies that China set out to accomplish in the Made in 2025 plan. China has, led in 7 of these critical technologies, and is catching up in 5, and is only lagging in 1 with commercial aircraft. Now we can delve into that. I think the U.S.'s trade war is probably going to help China to accelerate right on that C919 development, and we're seeing Boeing's sort of difficulty, right, to come back to the Chinese market. And so that again presents a golden opportunity for China's aircraft industry. So if we look at this technology growth, and we also look at the nature of technological growth, we have the confidence that China is going to continue to be able to innovate and develop technology. And better yet, China's technologies are developed in a way that is cost effective. It's also open sources. And so what that means is that these technologies can be very quickly and widely integrated into the broader economy, right, in various industries and services sector. And so I think that would help to drive economic growth through that productivity growth, through what China calls the new quality productive forces. So that's from the supply side. I see this opportunity, and it's not easy to develop this really mature industrial clustering, this industrial supply chain. And China spent 40 years to get to the point today. It's not very easily replaceable or replicable by other countries. I mean, Vietnam, of course, is having a lot of huge potential, but size-wise, I don't think it can compete in China anytime. India, I don't think they have the same kinds of potential as China, despite the large population size. But I think the political system, the economic system are set up in such a way that they will not be as effective as China to be able to have this large-scale industrial takeoff. So that's from the supply side. Now, the demand side, I think there has been a long and very deep-seated misconception about China's economy. As many people call today, China is an export-oriented economy. China export is overcapacity because there's not enough domestic demand. And I think you and I know that is completely misconstrued. China is primarily reliant on domestic market. The domestic market is vast, with 400 million middle class, and the pool is growing, the size is growing, and with its income growth, the household consumption the growth over time in the past 20 years, the growth rate is over 8%, way more than the world average of 3%. And disposable income is pretty much on par with GDP growth in the past 20 years. So there's no such a thing as Chinese households don't get enough income share and they don't see consumption growth. That's a complete myth. Now, in terms of the consumption to GDP ratio, the share, I know that a lot of people argue this is way too low. But again, I think, first of all, the calculation of consumption is completely underestimating the real consumption. If you look at the retail sales and you look at the total consumption, retail sales account for about 91% of the total consumption. So that means the Chinese household only spend 9% on services. I mean, that is completely under estimation, right, of China's consumption. And even we take that back and say, okay, yes, China still has a large room to improve consumption. Well, that's precisely what China has been doing, especially since the peak, as I said, the net export to GDP ratio peak in the mid 2000s, and then the home consumption increases and the government consumption increases, the final consumption increases as percent of GDP, all until the COVID. During the COVID time, because the rest of the world shut down, China was able to export a lot more. And I think that's benefit for the rest of the world. So you start to see that net export to GDP ratio increases. You start to see household consumption GDP ratio decline from that point on. And post-COVID, things are still gradually come back on track. Household deposits are still very high, to the tune of $22 trillion bank deposits sitting out there as of March 2025. So it will take some time for households to, reduce the precautionary spending, savings, and start to spend again. But the long story short, I do think that China's, domestic consumption is the major driving force of its GDP growth. China does not rely on export. Export to GDP ratio in China is 19.7%, which is lower than the world average of 29.3%. So China is not export oriented. China is not export led. You might say this in the 1990s. You might be able to say that right after the WTO accession. But again, things have changed in the mid 2000s. And people just, for all kinds of reasons, are very slow to catch up with that reality that China has undergone this so-called structural transformation in its economy. Can China do more? Of course, right? China can do more. Fiscal spending more on welfare, increase social safety net, and so on and so forth. That can be done. And I would argue it should, because ultimately you want to have higher living standards and all of that. But to say that China is over-reliant on export, China is exporting its overcapacity, I think that is completely a misconception. It's a myth about China's economy. Now, I do think that China is a large economy, so just even if a small percentage of its GDP is being exported, it could create a lot of stir in the global market. But we also need to understand, right, this was more of the case back in the 2000s. But we don't see so much pushback from the Western world. Now, all of a sudden, they're talking about China overcapacity. China is, taking over the world. Well, the reason is very clear. This is what JD Vance said. China does not stay right at the role that it's assigned to, which is to produce low-end manufacturing labor-intensive products. Now China wants to produce semiconductor, it produces EVs, it produces solar panels, right? How dare you? How dare you climb up the global supply chain? So I think that is really the fundamental reason. As Jeffrey Sachs said, right? China is a threat, not because it's done something wrong, it's because it's successful. So I think, it's important to kind of put that in context as far as the demand side is concerned.
Wow. This has been a tour de force. I think we might draw a line here today so that our viewers can go away and digest all the information that you've presented and the picture that you've painted, and perhaps use this as an opportunity to reflect upon the caricatures that many people have in terms of the mental mind map that they have about the Chinese economy and how the Chinese economy actually works on the ground. So once again, thank you very much for sparing the time to join us today, Professor Yen Liang.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.